All right, we're about to go live with question period. This is a statement period that precedes question period every day.
Mr. Speaker, Quebec places a strong value on its relationship with Taiwan, and last December we were able to highlight the opening of an office in Montreal, which will undoubtedly facilitate exchanges between this fascinating nation, which is particularly keen on technology, particularly semiconductors, and our metropolis, which a great independence-minded Premier, Bernard Landry, saw as being a future pole in this same field. The Bloc Québécois unreservedly supports Taiwan's entry into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Although we've had and continue to have reservations about the content of this massive trade agreement, any nation wishing to be part of an agreement of this nature should be able to do so long as it meets the membership criteria. Another great independence-minded Quebec Premier, Jacques Parizeau, was fond of saying that the size of a country didn't matter as long as it was part of a large market. This little island will be an invaluable asset in the global supply chain. It's a win-win situation.
The honourable member from North Okanagan, Shuswap.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years, this Prime Minister has shamelessly delivered record-high deficits, driving up inflation and causing sky-high interest rates. His government has doubled rent, mortgage payments, and down payments. Food banks received a record $2 million in a single month last year, and 1 million more are expected to use food banks this year. He has added more to the national debt than all previous prime ministers combined. While life has gotten worse for Canadians, this PM is spending more than ever. Now, a leading economist says that rate cuts may be delayed because of high government spending. We saw that this week when the Bank of Canada held its rate in efforts to maintain its policy of quantitative tightening. Canadians are seeing this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. Will the Prime Minister cap his spending with dollar-for-dollar rule and bring down interest rates and inflation, or will he continue to make Canadians pay for his failures?
The honourable member for Laval-les-Îles. Mr. Speaker, Richard Ibrahim, with the help of Nicolas Abou Faisal, who is president of the Gathering of Industrialists in Zalé and the Beka, are both perfect examples of humanitarian service in their country. These are men who have done great work for the environment. They've planted 128,000 trees, Mr. Speaker, to protect the environment, and they will continue to plant more. Richard Ibrahim and Nicolas Abou Faisal are philanthropists who work to further humanitarian aid. They support widows and orphans. They pay the hospital bills for the underprivileged, and they offer medical equipment to regional hospitals who help those who need it most without having to pay. Their creative and altruistic spirit has made them known.
For Canada, Lebanon, I thank both of them. Thank you.
Questions orales, oral questions. The honourable member from Thornhill.
We know that the Prime Minister is not worth the cost, and after 8 years, this Prime Minister is no longer even listening to Canadians. A 23% carbon tax hike in the face of Canadians who can't afford to eat. Yesterday, this House passed a Conservative common sense motion calling on him to convene an emergency televised carbon tax meeting with all 14 premiers. The Prime Minister is hiding, but maybe someone over there can tell us what day will the televised carbon tax meeting be?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, today we are debating Bill C-50, the Sustainable Jobs Act, which the Royal Bank of Canada says there are 400,000 of to come to Canadians if we were just to unlock the kind of prosperity envisaged in this very progressive piece of legislation. Instead, the Conservatives put forward 20,000 amendments generated by artificial intelligence. The Robo-Caucus needs to stop its robo-work with its robo-amendments and stop gatekeeping the opportunities that are coming to Canadians.
Right on. member from Thornhill.
It's false, and that wasn't an answer. Canadians need relief and not more liberal taxes. 70% of Canadians are now saying so. 1 in 10 people in Toronto are now relying on a food bank, and more than half of Canadians are $200 away from missing their bills. If they aren't going to listen to Canadians, if they aren't going to give us a date, perhaps the member can tell us what channel will the carbon tax meeting be on.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, the channel they should be plugged in, I don't know what it is, but it is the reality channel, because back here in the real world, there are real jobs at stake, there are real opportunities at stake, there is affordability at stake, and these members, the Robo-Caucus, with their Robo-amendments, in the way of opportunity and the way of progress and clean technology in this country, they need to get out of the way, stop the gatekeeping, let Canadians create the wealth that we need to succeed.
The Honourable Member from Thornhill.
Once again, he didn't answer the question, and I'm not really sure what that was. But if he won't listen to Canadians, and they won't listen to their NDP caucus, the Prime Minister won't listen to his successor, Mark Carney, who also wants him to meet with premiers. They won't give us a date. They won't give us a time. They won't tell us what channel to watch. The Prime Minister won't even show up here and answer to this motion. The Prime Minister is being defiant when Canadians are lining up at food banks in record numbers. What are you covering for?
The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has repeatedly said he is all ears. If there is a better plan, put it on the table. Premier Moe himself said this was the most cost-effective plan, and that's why our government will keep going with it while maintaining our AAA credit rating, while maintaining the lowest debt-to-GDP ratio in the G7, and while maintaining historically low unemployment. Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we will always vote with Canadians and support them along the way. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Bellechasse-les-Outremer-Lévis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After 8 years of this Prime Minister, we've suffered a passport crisis, an increase in violent crime, the doubling of rent costs, millions of people going to food banks, and criminals in our very homes. That's a great record. Quebecers are suffering because of this government's mismanagement, and now it's invading provincial jurisdictions. Will the Prime Minister listen to the Premier of Quebec, who is asking to finally mind his own business? The Honourable Minister for Public Services and Procurement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Six affordable housing units. That's what the Leader of the Opposition built when he was Minister for Housing. Throughout Canada and throughout his mandate, with the collaboration of the Government of Quebec and hand in hand with municipals, 8,000 units will be built over the next few weeks. I would like to invite my colleague, the member for Bellechasse-les-Outremer-Lévis, to come with me to visit a building project in Lévis, where there will be 23 affordable housing units just for that unit and that project. The Honourable Member for Bellechasse-les-Outremer-Lévis. To the already long list of failures of this Liberal government, we can add a total slackness in the management of public finances and the squandering of Quebecers' money. The government spends Canadians' money indiscriminately. It has no budgetary discipline over the past 8 years, and as a result, the debt is doubling. It has not balanced a budget, and then it wants to manage the province's affairs and lecture them. Quebec Premier François Legault is adamant that this federal government should finally mind its own business. Will the government listen to him, yes or no? The Honourable Leader of the Government in the House of Commons. Mr. Speaker, let's just talk about a former Premier of Quebec, Mr. Charest, with whom this very member sat and voted for a pollution pricing system. And so I think that the hypocrisy from that side is rather striking, especially in a context where today we're talking about 400,000 potential jobs in Canada, thanks to green technology, thanks to our new economy. That member is against these kind of opportunities in battery factories in Quebec, for example. On this side of the House, we are for opportunities for Quebecers, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member for Salaberry-sur-Roi. The housing issue proves that the federal government must be prevented from interfering in Quebec's area of jurisdiction. When the federal government decides where the money goes, Quebecers get done dirty. CMHC figures prove it in black and white. Since the creation of the federal housing strategy in 2019, do you know, Mr. Speaker, how much of the funding Quebec has received? When is the federal government that chooses projects? 6.7%, Mr. Speaker. 6.7% isn't even a third of our fair share, Mr. Speaker. Will the government stop shortchanging Quebecers and transfer all the housing money unconditionally to Quebec? The Honourable Minister for Public Services and Procurement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've already talked about the 6 housing units of the Conservative leader. So now let's talk about the 8,000 affordable housing units, thanks to the leadership and the partnership between us and the province of Quebec and various municipalities in Quebec. The member for Salaberry-sur-Roi, in her riding, is no doubt aware of the Pédalo housing project with 48 accessible and affordable housing units that are adapted to climate change. That will bring real difference for dozens of people in her riding. I would be happy to go to that housing unit project with her to show her how important our collaboration is with Quebec and for the people of her riding. The honourable member for Salaberry-sur-Roi. Quebecers constitute 20% of the population of Canada, and we receive 6.7% of federal investment in housing. When it's the federal government that chooses projects, so you don't need to be a math whiz, Mr. Speaker, to figure out that we are being absolutely ripped off. Since 2019, the money has been used mainly to fund projects outside of Quebec. We are in the midst of a housing crisis, Mr. Speaker, and we are paying through our taxes to house Ontarians while we can no longer afford in Quebec to pay the rent here at home. Do you now understand, Mr. Speaker, why we need to keep the federal government as far away as possible from our exclusive jurisdiction over housing? The Honourable Minister for Public Services and Procurement. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I understand that the Bloc Québécois perhaps doesn't appreciate good collaboration between the Quebec government and the federal government, but we've signed an agreement just a few weeks ago, an 8,000 affordable housing unit agreement, which is the biggest investment in affordable housing ever seen in Quebec, in all of Quebec's history. And that is because the government of Quebec and the federal government are working together in order to allow Quebecers and other Canadians access to affordable housing. The honourable member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Mr. Speaker, Montreal has seen its highest rent increase in 30 years. A true crisis that is preventing Montrealers from finding a roof under which to live. And what is the Liberal government's solution to this? To build only 35% of affordable and social housing units in the Wellington Basin. So, that means offering 2/3 of housing that is not affordable. Simple question. Why use public land to build housing that Quebecers cannot afford? The Honourable Minister for Public Services and Procurement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Very happy to hear this question from my colleague. It shows once again the contrast that exists between this government and the previous government. In 2017, we implemented our first national strategy with regards to housing in our country's history, so that we can, which is a contrast to the Conservative leader who, when he was housing minister during his entire term and throughout the country, only built 6 affordable, Mr. Speaker, 6 affordable housing units.
The honourable member from London Fanshawe.
The women and men in the Canadian Armed Forces have faced a military housing shortage for decades. Under Liberals and Conservatives, military housing has not been built and existing units are falling into disrepair. And now the Liberals want our armed forces to wait another 2 years before they even start building homes. This delay is unacceptable. Why is the minister delaying building urgently needed homes for the men and women who serve our country?
Honourable Minister for National Defence.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and making sure that we provide adequate supports, particularly for housing and childcare, is absolutely essential for us to support the men and women who serve in Canadian Armed Forces. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, in our recently released defence policy, we've included a substantial investment of over $300 million to build housing. But, Mr. Speaker, that work has begun and will continue apace. And I look forward to working with all members of the Defence Committee as we bring forward important new initiatives to support the men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces.
The honourable member from Regina Capel.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is just not worth the cost, and now his carbon tax scheme is completely falling apart. First, his own budget watchdog proved conclusively that most Canadians are worse off even with the rebate. Then he was humiliated into granting a partial carve-out because his Liberal MPs were sick of the backlash they were getting from their voters. And now a majority of premiers are demanding an emergency carbon tax conference to put forward better ideas than his punishing tax. If he's so sure that his carbon tax is so good, then why doesn't he just sit down and listen to the Premier?
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources and Energy.
Mr. Speaker, later today we will be voting to advance the Sustainable Jobs Act. It is a critically important act in the context of growing an economy that will thrive in a low-carbon future. It will ensure that workers and environmental organizations have a seat at the table when we are discussing Canada's Green Economic Plan. The Conservatives have obstructed at every turn, including introducing 20,000 robo-amendments. We are building a strong economy for the future. The Conservatives, by contrast, are engaging in legislative vandalism.
Before I pass on the floor to the honourable member from Regina Capel, I'll ask all members, please only the members who do have, who are recognized by the Speaker to let their opinions be known. The honourable member from Regina Capel.
Well, Mr. Speaker, none of that is true. But what is true is that yesterday, in a historic vote, a majority of MPs demanded that the Prime Minister sit down and just listen to the premiers. It's baffling to understand why he's so afraid of meeting with them. It's not like they're going to ask him to put together IKEA furniture or help them move. They just want to put forward better ideas than hiking prices on everything. What is he so afraid of? Is it Doug? Is it Blaine? I know Scott Moe, Mr. Speaker. He's a really nice guy. Why doesn't the Prime Minister just meet with him?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, Scott Moe said he sat down and pored over the data and could not possibly find a more effective way to combat GHG emissions than this government's policy on pricing pollution. You know, right now, today in this House, we are discussing untold employment and economic opportunity for Canadians, including the people of Regina Capel. If he won't stand up for the workers at Regina Capel, we will, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Regina Leuven.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'll invite the House Leader to come out to Regina, and Scott Moe and I can have a beer and we can figure out what Scott really said about the carbon tax. Just last week, this Prime Minister raised the carbon tax by 23%. That increased the price of gas, groceries, and home heating for all Canadians. Mr. Speaker, I am unsure of why this Prime Minister is so scared to meet with all the premiers. 6, 7, 8 premiers want to meet with the Prime Minister and see what he has to say about his flagship carbon tax policy. Why won't he listen, or does he just not care?
The Honourable Minister for Women and Gender Equality.
Mr. Speaker, let's talk about caring and young people, if we might, and affordability. Young people said they needed a break on interest and student loans. We did that. Kids getting out of school, home savings account, which 500,000 young people now have, so they can save towards their first home. And now rent payments will build rental history, credit history, because when you pay rent, it should count. Mr. Speaker, young people have asked, we have answered. The question is, what do you have to say? What are you going to cut? Are you going to cut these measures?
The honourable member, sorry, thank you for reminding me, members, that all questions should come through the chair and not directly to other members. The honourable member from Regina Leuven.
One of the first things we're going to cut is about 70 or 80 Liberal MPs in the next election. And secondly, 9 out of 10 young Canadians believe they'll never own a home under this government. It's embarrassing, Mr. Speaker. Canadians used to be able to pay off a home in 25 years. Now it takes 25 years to save to even afford a down payment. This Prime Minister refuses to listen to our premiers. If he's so proud of his carbon tax, will the Keller of the county come out of his house and actually meet with premiers?
I'd like to remind remind all members and as the Speaker has made this point before, it's important not to call into question any member's courage. The Honourable Minister for Seniors, Labour and Seniors.
I think, Mr. Speaker, on this issue, it is very important to list the constituents. I'd like to quote Danielle from Foothills. She said, "I do my family's taxes, so I know we got $850. We get an extra little bump for me and my husband because we live in a rural environment. And when I go back and I look at what I spent last year in carbon taxes because I was working from home, I wasn't commuting, my gas bills were way down, and even the amount of tax that I paid on my home heating bills were principally natural gas for where I live. I would say that I probably ended up better off with that transfer. We should listen to constituents like Danielle of Foothills, Alberta." Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. The Prime Minister has spent the last 2 weeks reminding Canadians of the disasters he has caused over the last 8 years: passports, immigration, late job insurance payments, inflation, interest rates, and of course the doubling of rent costs. And the list is very long. And yesterday his Liberal members voted against the Conservative motion that was adopted by this House to have a meeting with all premiers. The last meeting was in 2016. Will he or will he not call this meeting? Or does he prefer to continue destroying everything through interference without consulting the provinces? What is he scared of? The Honourable Minister for Innovation. On this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, we act. On the other hand, Canadians hear that there is absolutely no action. And no action or inaction is not a strategy. Inaction is not a plan. Inaction is not an option, Mr. Speaker. On this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, we have a plan for Canadians. We will invest in a greater number of housing units. We will invest in childcare, Mr. Speaker. We will invest in jobs. We will invest in growth. Mr. Speaker, we'll let them create their slogans while we will continue to actually work for Canadians. The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. After 8 years of this government, let us talk about its record, Mr. Speaker. Housing costs have doubled. Immigration waiting times are never-ending. Over 800,000 Quebecers are using food banks every single month. Our streets are less and less safe. Violent crime is on the up. And bad news, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister now wants to impose his incompetence on the provinces. It's like giving the key to our house to the very vandals who have just ransacked it. Will the Prime Minister finally admit that he has absolutely no skill in managing his own government and that he should, for once, mind his own business? The Honourable Minister for the Environment and Climate Change. Mr. Speaker, we could talk about vandals, but let us talk about climate vandals who are just on the other side of the House, Mr. Speaker. The member on the other side wants to know what the benefit of carbon pricing is. It's not difficult. All he has to do is look and speak to the member right behind him, who was part of the very first government in North America to price carbon, because it's the right thing to do, Mr. Speaker. It's the right thing to do for the economy. It's the right thing to do in fighting climate change. It's the right thing to do for Canadians. The Honourable Member for Saint-Jean. The Minister for Immigration, Christine Fréchette, reiterated the Quebec government's minimum demands. Nothing spectacular, no exaggerations. She's not asking for full powers in immigration, just a bare minimum: fair distribution of asylum seekers between the provinces, reimbursement of reception costs, and adequate funding for francisation. I don't think that's not too much to ask. Will the government respond positively to Quebec's demands, or will we end up with yet another Liberal squabble? Because they seem to love that. The Honourable Minister for Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. Mr. Speaker, what I've agreed with Minister Fréchette when I met her 2 weeks ago would be that we would use our full powers in our respective fields of jurisdiction under the Canada-Quebec agreement in a reasonable and reasoned way. That is what I expect to do with her over the next few months. Canadians and Quebecers will benefit from this. The Honourable Member for Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, the discussions are going so well that the Quebec government is thinking of holding a referendum on immigration. The truth is that Quebec is so fed up of being laughed in the face by this government that it is thinking of turning to the people. Given the federal government's incompetence in managing its responsibilities, we all know that things would go a lot better if Quebec had full powers. Will the minister respond to Minister Fréchette's very reasonable requests, or would he prefer to wait for the entire population of Quebec to express its views on this federal government's incompetence when it comes to immigration? The Honourable Minister for Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. And Mr. Speaker, there's not a country in the world that would give full powers to someone else. What I have agreed upon with Minister Fréchette is that we would follow our respective responsibilities in our respective fields of jurisdiction to best serve Quebecers, and that's I will do, and that's what the Minister will do as well. The Honourable Member for Drummond. The French Prime Minister is visiting Canada and Quebec. We all know the special ties that Quebec has with this great country, the cradle of human rights and secularism. At a time when monarchists are proudly singing God Save the King, when the tragic history of Acadians is being trampled underfoot, I believe there is an opportunity to remind France that we still share some democratic values. Will the government undertake not to contribute in any way, either directly or indirectly, to the challenge to Bill 21 on the secular nature of the Quebec state? The Honourable Minister for Justice. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I have already mentioned a number of times, as has already been mentioned by the Prime Minister himself, with the current situation with Bill 21, when the situation reaches the Supreme Court, were it to arrive to the Supreme Court, we'll be here to intervene to defend the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and to defend rights like the right to free speech, the right to equality, and religious rights. Thank you.
The Honourable Member from Lambton, Kent, Middlesex.
Speaker, after 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. But don't take my word for it. Heather from Newbury writes, people need the cost of living brought under control now. And Carol from Strathroy says, one more tax will take us down. We're already struggling. To the average Canadian, the cost of the carbon tax on gas, groceries, home heating, farmers and families is punishing, not progress. So will the Prime Minister axe the tax on farmers and help make food cheaper by passing Bill C-234 in its original form?
The Honourable Minister for Labour and Seniors.
I thank the Honourable Member for that question, and I would allow Danielle from Foothills to continue with her comments. She also added, I would say that I probably ended up better off with that transfer. She also said, and so I think a lot of people would be of that view, that if you are going to implement some kind of revenue-neutral carbon pricing, that's probably not a bad way of doing it. Now, these are the words of Danielle from Foothills. I'm happy to inform Danielle that 2.5 years later, since she made that comment, it is now up to $1,800 for a family of 4 in Alberta. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from Lambton, Kent, Middlesex.
Well, Mr. Speaker, even the NDP Liberal Environment Chair admitted that the carbon tax has no impact on climate change. And yet, just last week, the Prime Minister increased the carbon tax by 23%, driving up the cost of gas, groceries, and home heating. If farmers cannot afford to grow food, you have failed as a government. And let me remind everyone, no farms, no food. So will the Prime Minister help bring the cost of food down for Canadians, axe the tax on farmers, and pass Bill C-234 in its original form?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, instead of opposing battery plants, instead of standing up against sustainable jobs, that member and her caucus should remember that farmers have the vast majority of the fuels they use, which are tax exempt under the pollution pricing strategy. Farmers in this country are supported big time by adjustment policies because they know more than anyone that climate change is a reality. And with respect to Bill C-234, that member should walk down to the front bench and tell her opposition House Leader that he should call Bill 234 and we'll resolve it.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Member from Dauphin, Swan River, Neepawa.
This NDP Liberal government is just not worth the cost. Last week, the Prime Minister increased the carbon tax by 23%, driving up the cost of gas, groceries, and home heating. But on Tuesday, the Liberal Environment Chair revealed there is no proof the carbon tax reduces emissions. Quote, there is no data specifically stating the price on carbon resulted in an X amount of reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, end quote. Now that the carbon tax scam has been exposed by a Liberal, will the Prime Minister finally axe the tax?
The Honourable Minister for Energy for Natural Resources and Energy.
On this side of the House are focused on making life more affordable for Canadians, but also on fighting climate change. The PBO and 200 economists across this country have been very clear. 8 out of 10 Canadian families get more money back. It works disproportionate to income. Even the Conservatives actually used to know this before they got collective amnesia. Every one of the members on that side of the House ran in 2021 on a promise to put in place carbon pollution. The hypocrisy that comes from that side of the House is unbelievable.
The Honourable Member from Nunavut.
First Nations and Inuit have been neglected by successive Liberal and Conservative governments for years. They have underfunded infrastructure for First Nations by $350 billion. Wow. For Inuit, the gap is $75 billion more. The Liberals committed to closing this gap by 2030, but they are nowhere near their target. This means more moldy homes, more crumbling schools, and more contaminated water. When will the Liberals fulfill their obligations to First Nations and Inuit by closing this infrastructure gap?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Crown Indigenous Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Member for that very important question and for her advocacy in this House. We thank the Assembly of First Nations for their partnership. We actually worked together with them on this report, and we welcome the important recommendations that it brought forward. We know that decades of underinvestment and discrimination have led to this infrastructure deficit, which is indeed a crisis for Indigenous peoples across this country. Our government has put a stop to this with record investments by dramatically increasing up to 1,100% since 2016. We are taking action to close that infrastructure gap, and we will not stop until it is done.
The Honourable Member from Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Mr. Speaker, there are many residential school survivors and family members of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls in British Columbia who are non-status. And this week, they're learning that their access to counseling is being cut off because the Liberals, like the Conservatives before them, are underfunding First Nations health. These are community members who've experienced serious trauma and for whom counseling is a key part of their healing journey. Why is this government denying survivors access to critical counseling?
Yes. The Honourable Minister for Crown Indigenous Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for that very important question. Violence against Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and gender-diverse people must be put to an end, Mr. Speaker. After the previous government dragged their feet for years, we called a national inquiry. We have an action plan that is co-developed with Indigenous partners. We made progress. For example, we built 12 new cell towers along the Highway of Tears in British Columbia, new shelters for Indigenous women, supporting frontline Indigenous victim services, 36 Indigenous-led policing services, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to do more. Bravo.
The Honourable Member from Kitchener South Hespeler.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians know better than to trust Conservatives' failed policies. On this side of the House, our government is focused on creating more good jobs, including in innovation and technology. Last week, in my riding of Kitchener South Hespeler, I was pleased to be with our government when we announced new measures from the upcoming Budget 2024 to secure Canada's AI advantage. Mr. Speaker, can the President of the Treasury Board please update this House on our government's announcement on AI?
Good question. The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for her hard work. Last week, our government announced $2.4 billion to support artificial intelligence across this country. That means more infrastructure for AI researchers. That means more innovative AI solutions for small and medium-sized businesses. That means the creation of an AI institute, and that means the responsible use of AI across the country. Unlike the Conservatives who deny science, we will always support an innovative economy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de Montmagny-Lillet, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup.
Monsieur le Président, après
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this Liberal government, life is more expensive and Quebecers are paying the price. Housing costs have doubled and lineups at food banks are longer than ever. Quebecers are struggling to feed themselves, and it's because of this Prime Minister's insistence on interfering in provincial jurisdictions. It's obvious this Liberal government isn't worth the cost. Will the Prime Minister finally withdraw from provincial jurisdictions so that Quebec can undo the damage? The Honourable Minister for Innovation. We will take no lessons from the Conservatives. We've created more housing in this country. We have a plan. We have a plan to create prosperity. What do we have on the other side is slogans. People at home know that slogans don't create housing, slogans don't create jobs, and slogans don't create prosperity. On this side of the House, we're going to focus on issues that matter to Canadians and let Conservatives invent more slogans. Canadians know what side they're on, and we're with them. The Honourable Member from Montmagny. 8 years of this Liberal government has given us a broken immigration system, an unsustainable cost of living, sky-high crime rates, and millions of Canadians who are suffering. This Prime Minister causes problems in every area of Canadian life, and he's also intruding on provincial jurisdictions. Quebecers have clearly understood. This Prime Minister is not worth the cost. Can the Prime Minister stop spreading his incompetence and just mind his own business? The Honourable Minister for Public Services and Procurement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Minding our business means investing in daycare and housing and high-speed internet. It's also about investing so that the children in the riding of my colleague have their bellies full. We announced an investment that's going to help 400,000 children, hundreds of which live in his riding, to go to school with full bellies so that they can learn and develop to their full potential. Unfortunately, they're going to vote against it when the budget is tabled. After 8 long years, the Prime Minister is not worth the cost. Food banks no longer meet demand. The cost of rents and mortgages doubled. The dream of first home ownership is nearly impossible for our young people. For 8 years, it's invaded provincial jurisdictions, and Quebecers' quality of life is worse. Instead of imposing his incompetence on the province, could he please just mind his own business? The Honourable Leader of the Government. Mr. Speaker, this member, like all Conservative MPs in Quebec, I would like them to talk to their leader because they're getting in the way of 400,000 possible jobs thanks to green technology. Like in Quebec, the battery plant will create thousands of jobs. This member knows full well that Quebec will prosper in a green economy. They should inform their leader and stop getting in the way of progress. The Honourable Member for Chicoutimi-Les-Fières. Mr. Speaker, we just have to think of ArriveCan, borders, passports, unemployment insurance, the deficit. Everything is going wrong. After 8 years, this Prime Minister has turned to failure everything that he has touched. He's insulting Quebecers even more by interfering in their areas of jurisdiction. Can the Prime Minister mind his own business and let Quebec make its own decisions? The Honourable Minister for Innovation. I think my colleague has amnesia because our government is the one that made the most significant investment in the history of Quebec. Northvolt is an investment that's going to build for this generation and the next. As we do this, we're investing in daycares. We're investing in housing. We're investing in mental health. We're investing in Canadians. We're investing in prosperity. We're investing in Canada. We're investing in Canadians, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to do so.
L'honorable député de Pierre Boucher, les Patriotes, Verchères.
Le fédéral contribue pas à régler.
The federal government is not helping to solve the housing crisis. It's dragging it out even longer. Ottawa could just transfer money for housing to Quebec, But the Liberals have instead chosen to impose conditions on the infrastructure program, supposedly to force provinces to build housing faster. But the result of all this is that in addition to slowing down building construction, Ottawa's paralyzing construction of infrastructure. They want to see doorknobs before setting up running water. Does the minister realize that his plan is putting the cart before the horse? The Honourable Minister for Public Services and Procurement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member is right to highlight the importance of investing in infrastructure, in drinking water, in wastewater treatment. We announced $6 billion, an additional $6 billion to support municipalities to help build infrastructure that will help us in Quebec and elsewhere to build the 8,000 units we've already planned with the government of Quebec, whose leadership is essential. It's a contrast with the 6 housing units that the previous Conservative leader achieved when he was in government.
Les patriotes verseurs.
Les libéraux ont du front tout le tour de la tête. Au lieu de se rendre.
The Liberals are shameless. Instead of making themselves useful, they've decided to be contemptuous and blackmail us with our own money, just like the Conservatives did back in the day. It's not surprising, given the recent announcement. Quebec's housing minister made it clear that there's no question of Quebec agreeing to a number of conditions to get its fair share. Quebec's cities don't belong to Ottawa. Can the minister commit to guarantee Quebec its right to withdraw with full compensation and no strings? The Honourable Minister for Public Services and Procurement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member is right to talk about that the Conservative leader is insulting. He insulted Quebec's municipalities, including the people in the city of Quebec. We announced, with the leadership of the city of Quebec, the construction of 324 affordable housing units. 324 is 50 times more than all of the housing units created by the Conservative leader when he was the Minister of Housing.
The honourable member from Fort McMurray, Cold Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After 8 years, Canadians are struggling to make ends meet due to the Liberal NDP's crippling carbon taxes. They're all economic pain and no environmental gain. Just last week, the Prime Minister increased the carbon tax by 23%, further driving up the cost of gas, groceries, and home heating. The least they could do is take the carbon tax off the farmers who feed us, which would in turn lower the cost of food. So my question is simple. Will the Prime Minister axe the tax on farmers and make food cheaper for Canadians by passing Bill C-234 in its original form?
Great question. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Bill C-234 was here, then it went to the Senate. Conservative senators threatened a bunch of other senators who wanted to debate the bill. The bill is now back in this House, and it is completely up to the leader.
The Honourable Minister has 20 seconds left on the clock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's rather impolite to interrupt the people answering questions, as the members across know. Bill C-234, put very simply, can be brought to the floor of this House on the simple whim of the Leader of the Opposition. That member should actually talk to him.
That's a good idea.
The Honourable Member from Dufferin-Caledon.
After 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, Canadians are well versed in their corruption. Sadly, it's worse. Bombshell testimony on Beijing's interference in Canadian elections. A senior Liberal disclosed top secret information to the then Liberal MP from Don Valley North that he was being watched by CSIS. Wow. This was a despicable breach of national security for Liberal partisan gain, and only very high-ranking Liberals would have access to this. A cabinet minister or a senior Liberal. Who is the person? Give us this Liberal name.
Dirty.
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, we worked collaboratively with all the opposition parties last summer to set up an independent judicial inquiry into foreign interference. We've seen a number of weeks of public testimony, including this week. We didn't think, Mr. Speaker, in the terms of reference, we had to put a line that would say we should have the basic respect for the integrity and independence of the Commission process, not to comment on every day's appearances, but to let the Justice do her work, and we look forward to her report in this important issue.
Well done.
The honourable member from Dufferin-Caledon.
There's no decency or respect when a senior Liberal, either a cabinet minister or a senior Liberal staffer, disclose top secret CSIS information for Liberal gain. It's despicable. It gets worse. This compromised CSIS work. It put Liberal partisan gain over national security, and the Prime Minister must have known. When did the Prime Minister find out? When did he call in the RCMP to investigate, or were the briefing documents just a bit too long so he didn't read them?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Again, Mr. Speaker, my colleague can repeat a series of allegations. We don't think that this is particularly constructive when a senior Court of Appeal justice is seized with this very matter, which is here. She is hearing evidence from witnesses and interviewing in camera all of the relevant officials, receiving all of the most classified documents. Why doesn't my honourable friend allow her to do this work and not continually repeat and interfere in the middle of her hearings?
Honourable members, please encourage you to listen to the person who is recognized to have the floor. The honourable member, l'honorable député de Sudbury.
Canada continues to support Ukraine. We've provided military support and aid. We're working with our allies and our partners all throughout the world. However, we must recall that this is not the first time Russia has behaved like an aggressor towards Ukraine. Can the Minister of Foreign Affairs reaffirm our long-term commitment to Ukraine? The Honourable Minister for Global Affairs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for her important question, because Ukrainians are on the front line of democracy. They're fighting for their freedom and ours. Putin has no red line. If he wins in Ukraine, he'll keep going. That's why we have to support Ukraine for our security and that of the world. That's why we concluded a new agreement, a $3 billion agreement for its long-term security. We've been there from the beginning, and we will continue to be there for them even after they achieve victory.
The honourable member from Carlton Trail, Eagle Creek.
After 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, we see historic levels of corruption. Conservatives have uncovered a tangled web of chaos, collusion, and cover-ups in the Arrive scam scandal. Just the latest example of Liberal insiders getting rich. GC Strategies opened its doors when this Prime Minister took office. This place will make history when it summons GC Strategies to the bar to answer our questions. Why did the Prime Minister make these scamsters multi-millionaires?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Again, Mr. Speaker, because our colleague repeats something doesn't make it factual. She knows very well, Mr. Speaker, that the Auditor General has looked into these matters. We've welcomed parliamentary committee review. People have been available, including senior government officials, to go before parliamentary committee.
I'm going to ask all members, please, to restrain themselves. There were a couple of very large or loud interventions while the minister was speaking. It's hard for me to hear the answer. Sometimes difficult for me to hear the question. I ask all members, and I know I could identify the members, but they're honourable members. I ask them, please, to hold their comments back. The honourable minister has 20 seconds left on the clock.
So, Mr. Speaker, as I was saying, the Canadian Border Services Agency is conducting internal reviews on this matter. The RCMP are also looking into these questions. We have said that anybody who has misused or abused taxpayers' funds will be held accountable, and we look forward to these processes coming to their conclusion.
The honourable member from Brantford Brant.
Mr. Speaker, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost or corruption. In the past year, this government spent over $21 billion on outside consultants. Rather than helping struggling Canadians, he's focused on making Liberal insiders richer. It's no shock that the Liberal-favoured GC Strategies, who pocketed $20 million for doing nothing on the Arrive scam, was founded the same year that he took office. Will this Prime Minister commit to cutting all waste and corruption in the upcoming budget, or will he continue to get more Liberal insiders rich?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, as my colleague knows, the Minister of Public Services and Procurement, the President of the Treasury Board, myself as Minister responsible for the Border Services Agency, have already taken steps to reduce reliance on outside consultants. Mr. Speaker, we've reviewed and changed the process for approving these kind of contracts. We'll continue to look at everything necessary to ensure that taxpayers' money is well spent, and those people that are responsible for these decisions know that they'll be held accountable in the case of misuse or abuse.
The Honourable Member from Brantford-Brent.
I hope the government holds itself accountable. The Arrive scam merely scratches the surface of the rot and corruption in this NDP Liberal government. Their procurement system is seriously flawed and broken. For example, they paid KPMG, a consulting company, almost 700,000 taxpayer dollars to learn how to cut back on consultants. You can't make up this lunacy. They've learned nothing. The question is simple. In the budget next week, will we see a cut to all the corruption?
The Honourable Minister for Public Works.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As our colleague, the Minister of Public Safety, has said repeatedly, repeating falsehoods doesn't make those falsehoods true. What they should know, however, is that the Auditor General did table an important report just a few weeks ago, which found that rules were not followed by a few public servants. Fortunately, many of these rules have been updated, and regulations and expectations around the use of those rules have been clearly communicated to all relevant public servants.
The Honourable Member from Vaughan Woodbridge.
Workers in Vaughan Woodbridge and across the country have been clear, Mr. Speaker. The Sustainable Jobs Act is critical to ensuring they have the tools and skills they need to build up our net zero future, from greener buildings to electric vehicles to clean energy. The tens of thousands of Conservative amendments on this legislation are designed to block this bill and block workers from getting a seat at the table. Can the Minister of Energy tell this House why are we here fighting for workers today?
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources and Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today we are in this House fighting for workers and communities in Canada so we can create sustainable jobs moving forward, we will grow the economy, and we will fight climate change. Standing in the way of workers is the Conservative leader, a proud supporter of notorious anti-worker legislation, including Bills C-377 and 525. His plan for Canada is to cut investments, to let our economy fall behind, and to let the planet burn. Our plan will ensure we are building an economy where Canadian workers and Canadian communities will win, and we will vote as many times as it takes to get it done.
The Honourable Member from Edmonton Strathcona.
Mr. Speaker, today I met with Mansour Shuman, a Palestinian Canadian who risked his life to report on the devastation and horror of the war in Gaza. Weeks ago, the Liberals promised to stop selling military goods to Netanyahu and to sanction extremists. As innocent children continue to die, they haven't issued export notices or announced sanctions. This is a betrayal of the hundreds of thousands of Canadians who want peace for Palestinians and Israelis. We need a two-way arms embargo and sanctions. How many more people will die before this government acts?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Minister for Global Affairs.
First and foremost, I would like to say that I've talked to the mother of Mansour Shuman many times as he was obviously struggling in Gaza, and we made sure that he could come safely back home working with the Minister of Immigration on this very issue. Second, on the question of Israel-Hamas and the war, of course we know that The situation in Gaza is completely catastrophic. The violence must stop. We need a ceasefire now. We need to make sure that hostages are released. We need humanitarian aid going in. And my colleague already knows when it comes to arms, we have not sent arms.
The honourable member from Kitchener Centre.
Mr. Speaker, it's been 2 years since this government committed $1.5 billion to build co-op housing across the country. Yet 2 years later, instead of returning to annual predictable investments in deeply affordable co-op housing, this one-time program hasn't even launched. Instead, last week we heard more announcements while thousands of shovel-ready co-op projects are still waiting. What's the point of making announcements if they're not going to spend the money? And when will the minister commit to these much-needed co-op homes getting built?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Whether it's co-op housing, whether it's missing middle housing, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, mid-rise apartments, that is the focus of this government, building more, dealing with that crisis in supply. This is what this government is seized with. In fact, I recently met with the federation responsible for co-op housing and its advocacy in this country. They remarked how happy they were with the progress that's been made. Of course, there's more to do, but lifting the GST off of that type of construction is something that I'd point to the member as well. There's a larger context here as well to pay attention to. We're getting it done. We're getting that work done. We're going to see more building.
Excellent. And thus comes to an end another question period. I'm now ready to rule on the question of privilege raised February 26, 2024 by the House Leader of the Official Opposition concerning the alleged premature disclosure of Bill C-63, an act to enact the Online Harms Act, to amend the Criminal Code, the Canadian Human Rights Act, and an act respecting the mandatory reporting of internet child pornography by persons who provide an internet service, and to make consequential and related amendments to other acts. The House Leader claimed that the bill's contents had been leaked to the media as evidenced in 2 separate reports from CBC and CTV News. Pointing to the anonymous quotes in the news reports, he concluded his remarks by positing that the information was leaked intentionally, knowing that it was wrong. In doing so, it breached the rights of members of Parliament and the House. For his part, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader countered that the envisioned legislation's objectives were widely known and already in the public domain long before the bill was placed on notice and introduced, given the government's prior commitments and extensive public consultations. Furthermore, the Parliamentary Secretary emphatically rejected the allegations that the government had shared the bill before it was introduced. Le leader à la Chambre de l'opposition.
The House Leader of the Official Opposition is correct in asserting that there are abundant precedents that once a bill is placed on notice, its contents are not to be disclosed prior to introduction, thus ensuring that members have the first opportunity to take note of the bill. The premature disclosure of bills has usually been seen as a contempt of the House. I would urge members please to take their conversations outside.
Please take their conversations outside of the House, including the member from Scarborough.
Okay, we're going to end it there. He's ruling on a motion of privilege that was made prior, and so question period is ended. I'll be looking at this more deeply and possibly commenting on it later. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next video.